Mr. President, this is a historic week here in Washington, D.C. Later today, Pope Francis will arrive in Washington for a 2-day visit. During his time here, the Holy Father will meet with President Obama, celebrate Mass, canonize a new saint, and address a joint session of Congress. This will be the first time a pope has ever addressed Congress. And in light of Pope Francis's historic visit, I believe today is an appropriate time to reflect on the importance of religious liberty in American life. This will be the first of a series of addresses I will be delivering on this vital subject. Religious liberty is an issue of deep significance to me. I come from a family of faith. I represent a state that was founded by religious pioneers fleeing persecution. In my many travels, I've seen people express religious devotion in a multitude of ways, affirming their belief in the divine through song, word, and deed. I've also seen misguided government officials limit religious expression, often in the name of security or some other nebulous goal. And I have seen people of courage stand up to these officials, refusing to accept claims that the commands of the state trump rights of religious belief. Nor am I alone in viewing religious liberty as a vitally important subject. Indeed, throughout our history, protecting religious liberty has been a priority of lawmakers and laymen alike. As far back as 1657, residents of the community known today as Flushing, New York, petitioned colonial leaders to end restrictions on religious practice that prevented some community members from practicing their faith. Their petition, known as the Flushing Remonstrance, declared that community members should be allowed to decide for themselves how to worship. 120 years later, in 1776, Virginia adopted a Declaration of Rights that proclaimed in no uncertain terms that, quote, all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience, unquote. Now, this was followed a decade later by the famous words of the First Amendment, which forbids Congress from making any law that prohibits the free exercise of religion. More recently, our leaders have continued to affirm the importance of religious liberty in both word and deed. In 1948, the United States joined 47 other nations in approving the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which of course proclaims that every person has a right to, quote, manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, or observance, unquote. 4 decades later, in 1800, Congress passed a law declaring that government may not, quote, substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, unquote, unless doing so is necessary to further a compelling government interest. And Presidents Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama have all issued proclamations affirming the continued importance of religious liberty in American life. President Obama's most recent proclamation, issued on January 15th of this year, called religious freedom a, quote, fundamental liberty, unquote. And he declared that every person should be free to choose, quote, free to choose and live their faith, unquote. There can be no question that religious liberty has been a central concern throughout our nation's history. Over the coming weeks, Mr. President, I will discuss a number of topics related to religious liberty. These topics will include, among other things, the legal and political history of religious liberty in our country, the ways in which religious freedom is under attack both at home and abroad, and what we in Congress should do to protect religious freedom against such encroachments. I will also address the history and importance of religion in the public square and the ways in which religion is beneficial to society. Today, however, I begin with first principles: why religious freedom matters, why it's important, why it's worth protecting. It's common when speaking of religious liberty to begin by noting that religious exercise is the first individual right listed in the Constitution. This priority of place denotes that religious exercise has special significance. Of all the potential rights out there, both God-given and man-made, the founders chose to list religious freedom first. Part of this, no doubt, had to do with history. The United States exists because of religious freedom. The Pilgrims set sail because they wanted to go to a place where they could practice their beliefs free from state interference. The founders of Maryland similarly sought a new land where an oppressed religious minority, Catholics, could live out their faith openly and honestly. Pennsylvania was a haven for Quakers and other religious groups. Although the motivations of colonists were multifaceted, the desire for religious freedom was a driving force behind many settlers' decisions to come to America. They came to escape persecution, to practice their religion as they wished, without the need for official state sanction or the threat of state-sponsored suppression. But history is not the end of the story. There is something inherent in the nature of religious exercise that merits special protection. To explain, I first need to talk a bit about the character of government. I will then connect my discussion back to religious liberty. Government, Mr. President, is at bottom a war of wills. It is how we answer the fundamental question of all human relations: who decides? Government is the instrument by which we place certain conduct off limits or make other conduct compulsory, and then back up those rules with threat of force. We may extol democracy as the best and highest form of government, while at the same time disparaging autocracy or other dictatorial regimes. But the difference between these governments is a difference of form, not function. All governments limit individual freedom. The question is, who decides what those limits are and how far they extend? When government limits freedom, it makes a value judgment that the conduct prescribed is less important, less worthy than whatever goal the government is seeking to accomplish. Take the fight against drugs. Long ago, Congress made a decision that avoiding the devastating consequences of drug addiction and drug violence is a more worthy goal than permitting people to choose for themselves whether to ingest certain mind-altering substances. We made a value judgment that reducing violence and preventing addiction is more important than giving people unfettered control over what they consume. And it is easy to see why. Violence and addiction are tangible, devastating harms that ruin lives and destroy aspirations. The ability to consume mind-altering substances, by contrast, is a narrow concern that does not go to any core concept of personhood. In other areas, the calculus may be more complicated. Whether we're debating the proper approach to energy production, health insurance infrastructure investment, education standards, or tax reform, we weigh competing values. The policy we ultimately select depends on which values we give greater weight, to which we give greater weight. Now, to religious liberty. I said earlier that religious liberty merits special protection. Indeed, it preserves preeminent protection against all other rights. The reason is that rights of conscience and of religious exercise go to the very heart of who we are as human beings and how we make sense of our world. There can be no higher value than enabling people to find purpose in their lives, to make sense of the sorrows and disappointments as well as the joys that attend life here on the earth. Indeed, the choices we make about what we believe and about who with whom we stand among the most important choices we make in life. When a person feels called by a higher power to perform some act or to refrain from some activity, that person is defining himself by reference to his beliefs. Those beliefs may seem irrational to some or silly to others, but to the person who holds those beliefs, they make all the difference in the world. When government interferes with religious exercise, Mr. President, It seeks to insert itself into the place of God. It tells the believer that his views about what really matters may be an interesting curiosity, a nice psychosocial experience perhaps, but that at the end of the day, they are illegitimate. The state's interests must prevail because the state is the source of justice and truth. What's really going on is a value judgment. Just as with all other government decrees, when the state commands a person to violate his religious beliefs, it makes a value judgment that its objectives, the state's objectives, override all contrary concerns. It just so happens that in this case, those contrary concerns are an individual's most personally held, deeply held beliefs. This is a problem for three reasons. First, we have or are supposed to have a limited government. Our government is supposed to serve us. It's supposed to help us to flourish, not vice versa. But the government that overrides religious belief is not a limited government. It is a tyranny. It presumes power to decide for its citizens the most fundamental and defining choices of life: who we are, why we are here, what our purpose is, and how we find happiness. No decision is more fundamental to human existence than the decision we make regarding our relationship to the divine. No act of government can be more intrusive or more invasive of individual autonomy and free will than the act of compelling a person to violate his or her sincerely chosen religious beliefs. We should have more humility, Mr. President, than to think we can define better than our fellow citizens the purpose of life and the ends thereof. Certainly a limited government such as ours ought not tell its people that it knows best on matters far beyond its ambit. Second, valuing transient policy objectives over deeply held religious beliefs places citizens on the horns of an impossible dilemma. Either obey God, whose commands are eternal and unalterable, or obey the state, which controls life, liberty, and property here on earth. There are some who seek to equate religious liberty with other forms of liberty, or to downgrade it to a form of, quote, belief liberty, unquote. Under this view, as explained by LDS Apostle Dallin H. Oaks, there is nothing particularly special about religious liberty. It is merely the ability to believe as one chooses about spiritual matters, just as one might choose a political party, a favorite philosopher, or a favorite actor. But there is no equivalency. Religious liberty alone goes to one's conception of self and of one's place in the universe. It alone goes to those most fundamental questions that help us find purpose in our lives. What's more, it implicates duties that transcend more personal choice or mere personal choice and become obligatory in the life of the believer. Professor Robbie George, the chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, explains powerfully the flaw in the claim that religious liberty is just another type of so-called belief liberty. Quote, the right to follow one's conscience and the obligation to respect conscience, especially in matters of faith, obtain not because people as autonomous agents should be able to do as they please. They obtain and are stringent and sometimes overriding because people have duties and the obligation to fulfill them. The right of conscience is a right to do what one judges oneself to be under an obligation to do, whether one welcomes the obligation or must overcome strong aversion in order to fulfill it, unquote. When government denies religious freedom, it forces believers to choose between duty to God and duty to man. Duty to man backed by a threat of force. No government that values its citizens' agency, and certainly no limited government that exists at the suffrage of the people, should put its citizens to such an impossible choice. The third reason why valuing state objectives over religious beliefs is a problem is that it sets up the state as moral arbiter. I will speak only briefly to this point. When the state declares certain beliefs out of bounds or unworthy of protection, it tells the world that the opinions of government officials trump rights of conscience. It tells believers that government knows best and that their benighted views, the believers' views that is, have been weighed and found wanting. The current wisdom, which may be contrary to the wisdom of all human history, must triumph, for no reason other than it is current and currently favored by government elites. All must fall before the state, which is supreme, both in matters of might and morality. This aggressive view of the state's moral authority has no place in a system of limited government and is completely contrary to our Constitution. Humility, Mr. President, should be our watchword. We should remember that we may be wrong. Now, this doesn't mean religious freedom should be unlimited, that there should be no boundaries on religious exercise. When a religious practice causes injury or threatens to upend important state goals, government does have a proper role to play in balancing interests. But the standard that must be met before the state intervenes should be very high. Again, we are not talking here about mere personal preferences, about things people would rather do or not do, all else being equal. We are talking about acts that, as Professor George puts it, individuals feel they have an obligation to do. An obligation that comes not from family or friends or from society, but from God Himself. Before we ask individuals to contravene commands that they believe come from a higher power, we had better be sure that what we're asking is absolutely necessary. We had better be sure that what we're asking furthers a compelling government interest and is the only way to accomplish that interest. Only this standard, which requires government to exhaust all other options before invading the religious liberty of its citizens, adequately accounts for the centrality of faith in the lives of believers and the proper relationship between individual and state. Mr. President, my argument today has been based on first principles, on the inviolate right of each and every person to work out for himself or herself the purpose of life and his place in the universe. It has also been based on the principle enshrined in our Constitution that ours is a limited government that exists to serve, not dominate, its people. I've purposely stayed away from arguing that religion is a good thing, a net benefit to society, because I believe that religious freedom deserves special protection separate and apart from whether religion makes men and women better citizens. Religious liberty should be a protected value because the state has no authority to tell individuals how they should approach the divine or prescribe for them the meaning of their lives. It is a matter of autonomy, a question of who serves whom. But I would be remiss, Mr. President, if I did not briefly outline the many ways religion and religious exercise have benefited our nation. Today, many people sadly view religion as a sort of fetter, a chain that holds us back as a society from achieving our true potential. They see religion as the antagonist of social justice, as a refuge for reactionaries who do not understand or who fear our modern world. This view, Mr. President, is not only short-sighted, it is ignorant. The two greatest social movements in our nation's history, the abolition movement and the civil rights movement, were inspired by religious conviction and led by religious leaders. We speak today of Dr. Martin Luther King, but we forget that before he was a doctor, he was a reverend. In 1967, the year before his death, Reverend King proclaimed, quote, "Before I was a civil rights leader, I was a preacher of the gospel. This was my first calling, and it still remains my greatest commitment. All that I do in civil rights, I do because I consider it a part of my ministry," unquote. Religion instills in our youth principles of morality and right behavior. I do not claim, Mr. President, that religion is necessary for a person to be a good citizen, but I do affirm that religion, rightly practiced, instills virtues, concern for others, a desire for good, objectives beyond the mere pursuit of present pleasures that lead to engaged citizens and a healthy society. Happily, religious freedom is not just a good in and of itself, but is a good for society as well. I will have much more to say on this topic in a future set of remarks. For present purposes, I will conclude with this point. Religious liberty is a fundamental feature of our republic. It is why we exist as a nation. It helps to explain why we have endured so long despite our many differences. It has been a bedrock of our laws for centuries and was largely uncontested until only a few years ago. It deserves continuing protection as a preeminent value because it safeguards our ability as citizens to find purpose in our lives and to define ourselves who we are. It matters more than any other freedom. That's why it was listed first in the Constitution. Too many of our fellow citizens, Mr. President, perhaps even too many in this body, have lost sight of the purpose and importance of religious liberty and of our duty as legislators to protect the freedom of all citizens to believe and to act according to their beliefs. I will return to this theme in the coming weeks as I deliver additional remarks on this most crucial topic. All I can say is religious freedom means everything to me. I think it means everything to people of goodwill who really have studied how this nation came about, how it progressed, how it overcomes some of the most monumental problems in the history of the world, and how we've been so successful after all these years. We have a tendency in this current climate, in this current world, to start to decry religious belief. I want to make sure that we don't end it, and that we augment it, and that we get back to where we should be as a nation so that we can continue to maintain this great nation as the greatest nation with the greatest freedom and the greatest Constitution in the world. Mr. President,